Good day to you. This is Wildman from Wildman Productions, coming to you with another tip. A lot of people like to come up with all kinds of ideas and so on and so forth for lubricating their helicopters. I try not to be so complex. Personally, something that I found that really works well for me is to use a simple solution like Permatex bulb grease. This is a dielectric silicone-based grease, and it actually, if it isn't going to break down the parts in your car under extreme heat conditions and work with your light bulbs and the heats they generate, it sure shouldn't hurt a helicopter. And it should do well for lubing everything up and keeping it running free. That being said, also another item I use is heavy duty silicone. Yep, Walmart special. Gotta love it. Anyway, what I like to do is I'll give you a few tips on how I like to grease up my helicopters and keep them all working great so that they have longer life, they run quieter. If you ever take them out of the box and you just run them straight, they make this grinding noise that'll just drive you absolutely nuts. That being said, let me show you how, the best way I've found how, to grease up one of these little buggers. Okay. Over here in front of me, we have two helicopters, a V912 and a V911. You can use this with any type of helicopter, and what I like to do is use this for the main gear that's down here at the bottom, and for the main gear in the V912. If you look down in here, you can see it. And for the main bearings that run up into your swash plate, run into your mainframe on the upper and lower mainframes here, I like to use just a splatter of the silicone grease, because this actually does a pretty good job. It keeps them lubed up, keeps them dry, and if it has dirt in it, it bubbles it out, usually, and it makes it nice and easy. So you might be asking yourself, what's the best way to get into a hole like this to try to grease it up? This one's already greased, if you can tell. It's been greased very lightly, and it doesn't want to focus, so we'll leave it at that. But if you look closely, you can see I've very lightly greased that. You don't want the grease to actually show, but you want it to lightly grease it. That being said, the best way I've found is you use a screwdriver, a small jeweler's screwdriver. You put just a dab of grease on the end of that screwdriver, and you dip it down in your frame, and you put a little dab on your gear here, and kind of smear it around as best you can, and then start spinning it, so that whenever you start spinning it as you're greasing it, you get that grease coated lightly around, or just a few splatters, and then you let the motor do the work. As whenever you fire it up, it'll sling that grease around. It'll sling the grease around and make it all hold. That being said, today I'm going to grease this little guy up. He's brand new. I've never greased him. So what we do here is, for the V911, they're fairly simple to grease. If I can get my camera to set. First thing I do is I pop the canopy off just to make sure that I'm getting to everything the easiest way possible. And set that little guy aside. Then you have a bearing down here in the bottom, and you have a bearing up here in the top. And you got your swash bearing. So what I like to do for my swash bearing is, the best access to your swash bearing is right here underneath your swash plate. If you look closely, you can see the bearing, you can see it clearly in there. So what I'll do, and you don't want to use much of this, I usually take like 1 or 2 squirts and just give it a light coating, and then I work it in. Just spin it around and let it work its way in. It'll get up into that bearing, and every about 2 times you run these things, you'll want to do this. And then for the main bearing, you come down here and you put just a couple real light squirts up into the bearing that goes in your upper shaft here, and it'll get up in there quick and easy. Give that a few spin arounds, Then you tip it back up this way, and you put a little tiny squirt down in here. Just a tiny bit. You don't want a lot. You don't want the stuff just dripping and pouring everywhere, because then, well, you're just going to make a mess. And then I work that around to make sure it works into that bearing. And then for the grease, I use just a tiny little dab of the grease. Set my Heli down. Get just a teeny tiny little bit of grease on your finger. I don't know if you can see all the more that's there, but that isn't much. And then what I'll do is I'll just put a light spattering on my gear and just work it around a little bit at a time. And I won't even use all that, believe it or not. And just that tiny little bit, if you notice, there's still a bunch on my finger. And then I circle that around, and that gets that all worked into that main gear and into your working here. And helps your helicopter run a lot smoother, quieter, less chances of any problems whenever you're running. What I like to do also at times is, if you notice you're getting a little bit of stiffness on your action for up here, you can put a tiny squirt of your silicone grease on your main fly bar, if you have a fly bar. Put like a tiny dab on your parts here. Well, if I can get to it. And then you don't even need to squirt it for some of this. You can just use the residual that stays in the tube for like your cogs, your connect points. And then put just another little tiny dab here at your wing. And that'll make everything work nice and free. And it flushes out any dirt, keeps everything working smooth and free. And then all you have to do is just put that little puppy back on. Some people even like to, since the main servos are your main point of getting access to making your swash plate run, is sometimes you can put just a little tiny dab on each of your little connectors for your servos. And I don't mean much, just barely a little bit, so that it just barely glistens like this. And then whenever you fire that thing up and start giving it its motion, it's going to be a lot quieter, it's going to last a lot longer. And if you apply this stuff about once every 2 times, about every 2 times that you fly the helicopter, my advice would be to go through that process just to make sure, or just double check your gear. But as far as all of your bearings, I would go ahead and add just a tiny little squirt of silicone oil to the helicopter itself on each of the bearings every 2 to 3 flights. That way you keep it optimally working with as minimal dirt as possible, because the heavy duty silicone, if you ever notice, if you ever use it, you'll notice whenever it comes out, it kind of bubbles and spritzes whenever it hits whatever you're putting the grease into. So what the silicone lubricant does is it also helps flush out the dirt and boil that off to the side and get the fresh grease down in there, which will extend the life of your bearings. It'll keep your helicopters from flying apart as quick. A lot of people like to say you got to use this oil, this grease, this oil, this grease. I say if you just use these, it does wonders for me, and I've been playing with some of mine for quite some time. They don't look it because I don't bash the living heck out of them like some people do. But anyway, that being said, it's just like with the silicone grease here. A lot of people will say, well, it might destroy the vinyl in your little nylon gears and stuff like that. It might deteriorate those. Well, I've got to say, if it doesn't deteriorate the vinyl and plastics in a car's taillights, it sure shouldn't cause a problem with that. I mean, however, albeit a lot of the vinyls and plastics aren't what they used to be. We won't get into that. But anyway, I am not sponsored. I have nobody who pays me in any way for this type of video. I'm doing it as a courtesy to try to help you out, so maybe your helicopters can last a little longer for each flight. This is Wildman, signing out.